today in this conversation with fellows from the Gold Institute for International Strategies is the Vice President for Strategic Affairs, Adam Lovinger. Adam, how are you today, sir?
I'm great, Neil. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for everything you do for the Gold Institute and also for your fantastic journalism. We really appreciate it.
Well, aren't you the best? Well, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. I think we've covered everything. So, Adam, strategic is in the name, or strategies is in the name of the Institute, and it's sort of your lane. So, could you talk to me about what is strategy compared to operational or tactical concerns, and how they're vertically integrated and useful before we get into some of the other parts of your background and the things that you do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and we in Washington throw around these terms a lot, and without really defining them. One of the difficulties, Neil, is that people do define strategy differently, even in Washington, and there's a lot of confusion about that. Part of the reason why is that Congress requires from the Defense Department and other U.S. government agencies, these annual strategies, whether it's the National Defense Strategy or the National Military Strategy, and it's kind of a funny thing because a strategy should be a highly secret, top secret document that lays out the various ways that America will achieve and sustain primacy in the world. And so it's not like we're going to be producing, whether we're in the Defense Department or elsewhere, a document that actually lays that out. So there's even a bit of dissimulation from our own government as to what is strategy. I learned strategy, Neil, in what's called the Office of Net Assessment. And that's, I would consider it the highest level strategy office in the Pentagon. And the point there really is, why do they call it net assessment? Well, all power is relative. So you want to look at the balance of power between America and our adversaries. And so one must do a net analysis. And the whole purpose of net assessment is to look, into the future, because strategy by definition is about the future, and to try to identify the strategic threats and opportunities for America. Looking at what are our comparative advantages, what are our enduring predispositions, and looking at those of our competitors, and try to identify the areas in which we, the United States, should be channeling the long-term strategic competition between ourselves and our adversaries, so that that channeling plays into our strengths and our adversaries' weaknesses.
Yeah, it's interesting that you give it a time peg. In journalism, of course, time is very interesting, right? Because the difference between a news article and a feature article is the time element. A feature article about someone selling flowers at the train station, it could run in October, it could run in August. Or if you're doing a story about a bank robbery, that's pressing and it has a sell-by date. And so I guess what you're saying too is that whereas the tactical is now and the operational is a little bit more time, and then the strategic is sort of that over the horizon. And so you really get to that point where how much do we have to play with? Whereas I guess it's, when you're in an emergency, right, and you don't have time to call Congress to do a declaration of war, and the president has to act immediately, that spontaneous in the moment decision making is right at the other end of the scale of where strategy is supposed to be. And I think maybe in current affairs, what we're seeing is, the decision making being taken sort of more of that tactical in the now moment, and not having that reservoir of strategy, that strategic equity, or even strategic reserve of that gives you a framework. So if you would sort of talk about where the United States strategic framework is right now, and where should it be?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Neil. So, the way it's supposed to work, the way, great powers have traditionally shape the global order to advance their interests and values is that net assessments would be ongoing within the highest levels of government, and those would then be informing strategies, and our strategies would be ongoing. And when various contingencies would arise, our operations and tactics would then be informed by that strategy. But one of the problems, Neil, is that we don't do net assessment anymore in this country, and we really don't do serious strategy either. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case. There's vast amounts of literature on it. But in my experience from over 10 years in the Pentagon, what I've noticed, Neil, is that strategy is quite threatening to the bureaucracy. It comes down to bureaucratic politics, and that, well, what is strategy? It's about big things. Big things can upset the status quo and threaten various rice bowls, threaten various weapons systems programs, threaten various contractors that have lots of power on Capitol Hill. And so there is an institutional aversion to both net assessment and strategy. And so we find ourselves.
No, it disenfranchises the stakeholders who may have been part of the old strategy, or maybe they're sitting on something that we used to think was important, but it isn't important anymore. So I'm just sort of like, in practical terms, a net assessment, 150 years ago or 120 years ago would say, hey, our ships need coal. We have a lot of coal in Kentucky, in Virginia, and this is very important to our Navy. And so when we're making assessments, we're not going to conquer a country or try to acquire coal from overseas because we have coal, but we will have coal fueling stations in Puerto Rico or the Philippines or Hawaii. But when the ships no longer use coal, so like the coal stakeholders, that last generation of they were very important in our strategic inventory, in 120 years ago, but the coal really has nothing to do with the Navy today. And so if you're coming up with a new strategy, if you're that coal guy, if you're the commandant of the coal facility, you're saying, wait a minute, this is my bread and butter. Have I capitalized that?
Yeah, you've completely nailed the principle 100%. And let's look at it, for example, in the military sphere. We create these Ford-class aircraft carriers that are many billions of dollars. A Chinese ship-killing missile or two or three can sink these things, and the Chinese can build 10,000 of these missiles for what it costs us to build one of these Ford-class aircraft carriers. But the Navy, of course, has, and it's the entities that build these carriers, and the contractors that are involved. There's this momentum, Neil, that's developed over the years that makes shifting to new, more nimble, more cost efficient, more lethal weapon systems, very difficult. And so you really nailed it. I mean, there are these institutional barriers to get in the way. And as you mentioned with coal, I mean, the coal lobby, even though we had, oil-fired, tankers and all these other, more advanced ways of transporting things, they, held on to coal for, periods of time that was not necessary. And, this is all part of, the democracy. Our democracy does have all these diverse stakeholders, but what we're really lacking, Neil, and the reason why we had no strategy in either Iraq or Afghanistan, I mean, these are the longest wars in US history, is because of these institutional interests that are just so hostile to strategy. And we're seeing that right now in Ukraine. The West was really not prepared for what's happening in Ukraine. Even though we were 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, we don't have any strategy for this contingency, even though it was entirely predictable, and Putin really advertised that he would be doing this for decades.
It's hard to argue 8 years after Crimea was annexed that Ukraine has snuck up on us.
Correct.
It's been in the forefront since 2014 at least. And it seems that people are making decisions, for instance, with, transferring the 29 Polish MiG-29s to the Ukrainian Air Force. Nobody, like, we didn't forget how to do it. Like, are we going to put them in Ramstein and then transfer them? How are we going to do that? Nobody had decided whether it was a good idea or not. Nobody had decided that part of our strategy was to create air superiority in Ukraine. Like, nobody had thought about it, I guess. I mean, is that what you're saying? Is it the case that everyone in the Pentagon is just worrying about the now, and nobody has the courage to step back and sort of challenge the stakeholders to reshuffle the deck?
No, that's absolutely right, Neil. And really, one of the main purposes behind the Gold Institute for International Strategy is to have the very conversation that you and I are having right now, which is that to recognize that the West and the Gold Institute is a Western-oriented organization, and that doesn't mean that it's just geographically, but it's the Western ideas. The liberal global order is what the Gold Institute is about upholding. And so we have fellows from the Middle East who believe in the liberal global order, democracy, human rights, rule of law, all these things that we hold dear in the United States. And the whole point here is that we recognize that without a strategy, the West is really finished. I mean, when you right now, Xi Jinping is sitting in Beijing, and in his mind, Ukraine, Western Russia, Europe itself, the US, this is all part of sort of Western civilization. And he is so thrilled to see Western civilization destroying itself. And it's really up to the leaders of the West to prevent this from happening. And that it's not happening. And the Gold Institute is trying to improve that. We have a signature product for the Institute, the collaborative net assessment with our Western allies. And if there's any time, Neil, when we should really be taking it seriously to get back in the business of doing serious strategy, it's really now.
And so the Institute could conceivably sit down with somebody in Hungary and say, all right, what is your strategic inventory? What are your strategic goals? And then where do we move forward from here?
Absolutely. And I think, what's clear
and
is
I mentioned Hungary because it's right. Hungary is like right on the edge of Ukraine. It's like there's all these dominoes that are ready to fall. And, and these guys are in the now. But go ahead, I cut you off. It's just such a frantic situation there.
Yeah, and one thing I've noticed, Neil, just in my professional career, is that I do see that the Eastern European countries, do have. I mean, they really value their rule of law, their democracies, because they lived under the thumb of the Soviets for so long. A lot of the Western European countries, even the United States, we sort of take our democratic liberal systems for granted, and we really let them get degraded. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese now realize that, well, they can infiltrate our systems and really perpetuate the internal rot, and they're very, very good at it. But I think you identified a strategic opportunity for the Gold Institute and others is to really work with Eastern European countries like Hungary, like Poland, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all of these countries that are really in Putin's line of sight, and to really work to inject more strategic logic back into our alliances and partnerships there.
Yeah, I'm also thinking, we have a very robust law enforcement practice at the Institute. And I think so many of these police departments right now are playing whack-a-mole and it's like every Monday morning we hear about how many people were shot in Chicago, and you actually have people saying out loud, do we even need a police department? And so I think maybe an opportunity for, say, the Gold Institute to deal with a police department or a law enforcement, the law enforcement leadership community of a state or a municipality. How could you take something that, sure, we could sit down with the president or prime minister of Hungary, but we could also sit down with a police department. Can you just sort of imagine, give me like what that walkthrough would be like?
Absolutely, Neil. In the dozen or so years, I was in the Office of Net Assessment, and then at the National Security Council as Senior Director for Strategic Assessments. One thing I've learned is that a lot of the practices that we have used historically to generate national security strategy, these practices can be applied to corporations, to city councils, to police departments. And it really it begins with the analysis of what is your particular police department's comparative advantages? What does the law enforcement environment look like in your region? How is it evolving? How has it evolved over time? Where do you think it's going? What are the your competitors? We use nation states at the Pentagon, but your competitors can be the criminals, in the region of a particular police department. So truly, Neil, the practices of strategy that we have used at the highest levels of the U.S. government can really be applied, to any institution that finds itself in a competitive dynamic. And of course, police departments are on the front lines of that.
And so, is your first question, what is your end state? And then sort of figure, so you determine an end state, and then you conduct an inventory of what you have to get there and what you need to get there. And then you look at those obstacles to take those steps to get to that end state. And, it's, and then I imagine there's some Taoism involved, right? It's, it's easier for the water to go around the rock than it is for the water to go through the rock, right?
Yeah, so actually
that's what I remember of Taoism, Adam.
Yeah, that's an excellent point about recognizing the rock and water going around it as opposed to through it. So I would actually even begin, I've been trained to begin even before one identifies one's objectives. And my training from Andy Marshall at the Pentagon is that the first step is really to survey, to assess the security environment itself. How is it evolving? How has it evolved historically? Where do we think the future security environment is going? What does it look like? What are its the most important characteristics of it? And also, sort of identify, who are either currently or could be in the future our strategic competitors, and then really evaluate, what are the enduring traits of them and us, and then you begin the analysis of what are your objectives. Because if you don't have a sense of, what are the governing dynamics of any strategic, in which the strategic competition will unfold, if you don't understand that, you might choose the wrong objective. And so I've been just trained to begin before that in order to identify the right strategic objective.
And I think that it's difficult too for Americans because to the north and the south, we have two relatively weak and relatively friendly neighbors. And then obviously on the east and the west, we have these giant oceans that give us this, real or imagined sense of security. So that the shock of Pearl Harbor and the shock of 9/11 initially was we couldn't believe anybody could reach us. And it just sort of shattered that. Whereas, with Vladimir Putin as a land power, right? The Russians are a land people, and wherever they see land, they see, they're trying to figure out how someone can ride their horses to reach us. And so to them, Ukraine is a forever threat if their enemies have access to Russia on land. Whereas, you don't have that same problem on an ocean, I think. And so to what degree does net assessment also work on gaming your rivals' decision-making and, their strategy, whether they say it or don't say it, and where we can sort of block them from achieving their goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the legendary Andy Marshall, who served as the director of net assessment from 1973 until 2015, when Obama fired him.
Of course.
Right. This guy was very threatening to the status quo, and even though he had powerful friends, I mean, he was pushed aside, and the office was taken over by another cast of characters. Marshall was trained as a mathematician. He was very quantitative. He loved data. However, in conducting net assessments, the trait that he found most useful was culture. It was the strategic culture of both the US and our adversaries, its political culture, its military culture. Why is that? Well, strategy, by definition, is about the future. You can't focus on the here and now, like what's going on now, to understand the future, because things, of course, change. But there are various things, like culture, that are enduring predispositions that will likely continue into the future, almost assuredly. Another thing he liked to look at is demography, because we know, the babies born today in 20 years will be of military age. And so you look at the things that change, that are strategically important, the characteristics of nation states compared that are strategically important, and which we have the greatest understanding of, how consistent these trends will be over time. And so getting back to your question, Neil, and certainly the US, we don't have a lot of grievances, territorial grievances, because we conquered. we conquered the area which is now the United States of America. We never really cared so much about conquering Canada, or really cared so much about conquering Mexico. We're pretty happy. We're sort of a status quo power. Russia, on the other hand, has lots of historical grievances. Iran has historical grievances. China even has historical grievances. These are powers that bump up against their former empires, all three of them. China probably the least so, but they see Taiwan as part of their empire, and so there's other territorial things. So, coming back to one of a problem that a lot of Americans suffer from is that we don't really understand the mindset of someone like Putin, who will say, last month in a speech, he referenced developments 1,100 years ago in stating that, Ukraine is not a real country, it's part of Russia, same with Belarus. He even knows that the 18th century Russian leader, Catherine the Great, that under her, Russia occupied Beirut for 2 years. It's like this historical, cultural worldview that really governs the strategic behavior of a country like Russia, as well as China and Iran and other great powers, or at least powers that see themselves as great. But we Americans discount this, Neil. We don't know our history, and a lot of President Biden's statements recently show a terrible lack of understanding of who is this man, Putin, he's dealing with. He doesn't understand where he comes from. He doesn't understand his worldview. But this is very typical of American statecraft. It's culturally ignorant. We have this sense that if we just throw enough money and enough technology at various problems, we can take care of the problem, despite the fact that that never worked in Iraq and Afghanistan, and certainly didn't work in Vietnam 50 years ago. So it's a bit sad, Neil, in that we keep making the same mistakes over and over again. It does relate back to culture, and ultimately it is because of a deficit in our capacity to conduct strategy. that we are in this position.
Yeah, I think culture is a very strong point, whereas I think culturally the Russians even think of the ocean as an extension of land. And so they talk about, controlling blocks of the ocean or the Black Sea, whereas we inherited a maritime mindset from the English, so that our attitude is, we don't want to own the ocean. We just want to be able to use the ocean. So we always talk about freedom of navigation. We never really talk about owning chunks of ocean. We just want to be able to go back and forth. And so with the Chinese, our challenge to the Chinese is not to block them from using parts of the Pacific. Our challenge to the Chinese is saying, look, we can go wherever we want to. Same way with the moon, which I would suggest that space is an extension of the sea culturally, and sort of in the American mindset. We planted a flag on the moon, so the Russians are saying, "Oh, America thinks they own the moon," right? Or even the Chinese. I don't know of a single American who thinks we own the moon. We just want to be able to visit whenever we want to. It's like it's there. We went there. Putting that flag on the moon was just saying, "Tag, you're it." We got there first. Here you go. We have bragging rights. Now we're moving on to something else. Whereas, I see that in space as an extension of that, other countries, their culture is informing their actions. They're not reading our culture correctly. They're interpreting our culture through their own filters. And of course, we're doing the same things back at them. It's a very difficult situation to, when you have cultures talking past each other and hearing each other through those filters, and you accidentally get into a war. You were talking about the aircraft carrier. In the early 70s, the U.S. Navy had decided that the aircraft carrier was obsolete and was trying to move on from the aircraft carrier. But at the same time, the Soviet Navy was obsessed with the idea that the North Atlantic Trade Organization meant that the Americans think they own the North Atlantic. I don't know a single American who thinks that, but this is, the Soviets thought North Atlantic Trade Organization, they own the North Atlantic. And so they built one of their largest flotillas that they ever set up. And they sent this massive Soviet Navy flotilla up and down and all around the North Atlantic just to show that they could do it. Like they were just wanted to show off. And when the Americans saw it, they didn't think, oh, wow, the Soviets are trying to prove that they can use the ocean like everybody else. They said, wow, the Soviets are planning an attack. We better build aircraft carriers. And so the rebirth of the aircraft carrier program was just this cultural misunderstanding, which of course feeds into strategy and the lack thereof. I think that maybe Americans never felt they needed strategy because of our, I guess we call it, because of our strategic equity or strategic reserve on what I would say that was based on what Napoleon said: geography is destiny. And Poland has learned that lesson many times, and it sort of created that sort of that less sense of urgency in the U.S. side.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Neil. The U.S., we're sort of, the heirs of the Dutch Empire, the British Empire. I mean, these were trading empires. We're about a liberal global order with, freedom of navigation of the seas. This is our strength. And coming back to, where we are, today in confronting Russia and China and Iran, our mindset that there is this, liberal global order of the law of the sea, freedom of navigation, all of these things that Americans take for granted, and which we in America, know are our strengths because we do believe in free commerce and in free trade, as a force that will unite and bring peace, at least the modicum of peace. This, however, is increasingly being, seen in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran as, this is yet another part of this liberal global order that is being used to keep us down. And so this is one of the reasons why all of these countries, all of our adversaries, they chafe at the rules. Putin had no regard for the laws of war. I mean, he's committing all these atrocities. He's violating the Hague Convention, the Geneva Convention. Didn't care at all that he's violating the UN Charter by invading a sovereign state. It is just no interest in upholding this rules-based international order. Whereas for us in the West, this is our comparative advantage. This is our ace in the hole. It makes us rich because it allows us to trade. It unites us together. It is part of the shared Western culture because it is a symbol of our values of openness and democracy, and allowing the Russians, the Chinese to degrade these Western institutions, this U.S.-led global order, is really exactly what they want, and that's a very unfortunate thing. And just for example, Biden told Putin before the invasion, when he was threatening, when he was just essentially amassing troops on the border of Ukraine, that we are not going to respond militarily. In 1994, the U.S. was a signatory to what's called the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances for Ukraine. Ukraine relied upon these assurances by the United States that they would give up their nuclear weapons. This was the end of the Cold War, in exchange for security assurances. But
and just to be clear, I just want to break in to say it was like as the Soviets withdrew, all the missiles and things were left behind, and so Ukraine almost found themselves accidentally the number 3 nuke power in the world.
Well, they did find themselves the number 3 nuclear power in the world, but they, were given assurances by the West. They saw that the Western, liberal global order, Western institutions were responsible for the demise of the Soviet Union. They looked at them and said, this is powerful, that the West is united. They are giving us some assurances. They believed us that we would support them. Since then, since 1994, of course, America has, steadily eroded these assurances. We have the 2014, invasion of Crimea. The U.S. did, practically nothing. The Russians, saw that. So the following year, Obama issued his red line against the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Declared that if they're used, the U.S. would respond, and he didn't follow through on that commitment. And so this lack of trust, which gets repeated, time and again, this is something that if you don't have that trust, these liberal institutions that were set up to keep the peace, promote prosperity after the Second World War, like the UN and the U.S. being the primary guarantor of that, they just become words. They become empty vessels, and this is, of course, is provocative to dictatorships. Weakness is always provocative, but certainly Obama and Biden, with assuring the Russians he would not militarily support Ukraine, not only is the weakness itself provocative, but admitting that one is weak and projecting that to one's adversary all but invites war.
Yeah, of course, our strategic goal in 1994 was we wanted to have, it was our strategic framework that we would have, we would work with countries not to be nuclear, and that we didn't want more nuclear weapons. And so that strategy informed the operational objective. And basically we went in and we affected that. And then we didn't, it was our strategy, and we took it for action, and we affected that goal successfully, denuclearizing Ukraine. but then we weren't committed to that strategy. And I imagine if you ask somebody today, nuclear non-proliferation is one of our goals. I'm sure there's a lot of people at the Pentagon making good middle-class salaries, and their job is to figure out how to denuclearize places in the world. It's a strategy, but we're not actually committed to it. It just sort of sits there like a paper tiger.
Yeah, and you raise a good point, Neil, in that sure, our strategy is to denuclearize the world, and that's fine. I don't want a bunch of rogue actors with nuclear weapons running around the place. But when the U.S. is not perceived as being trustworthy, is not standing by the red lines that our president will draw, does not abide by the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on security assurances to Ukraine. What this actually ends up doing is our inability to honor our commitments is actually incentivizing these countries to develop nuclear weapons. It's it's the classic security dilemma, where the fear of America, which is supposed to be the world's primary power that stands behind our friends and allies, is actually, when the tough gets going, when the situation gets bad, we're not going to be there. We're unreliable. So it's interesting. Right after the Syrian red line that Obama laid out, saying, if President Assad uses chemical weapons on civilians, that's it. We're going to militarily respond. And when we didn't, I had a friend that flew and actually had a meeting the following week with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Japan. And the first question he asked my friend was, what happened to the red line? Because here is Japan, who has a security guarantee from the United States. And because of that security guarantee, Japan has not developed nuclear weapons because we've assured them that we'll stand behind them, should they go to war with the Chinese. And they're now really questioning that. So what happens, Neil, is, we're really on the cusp of returning to this, historical tragedy where in the rush for security, countries develop nuclear weapons because they can't trust America to be there. And so we make the world much more dangerous. And, so this projection of weakness and, lack of trustworthiness, this is, we're really playing with fire, and America needs to be believed. Our commitments must be ironclad, such that if we don't have to make commitments, but if we do, we must stand behind them so we're trusted.
Yeah, it's that's why you're the vice president of strategic affairs, not the vice president of strategic notions or whims or fancies. So Adam Lovinger, the vice president of strategic affairs at the Gold Institute for International Strategies, thank you for joining this conversation with me, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you, Neil. You're the best. Greatly appreciate it.
I'm just one of the best.